Hello, my name is Alexxis Stiely. I am a senior. I am an international business major with a specialization in globalization and policy and a specialization in marketing with a minor in political science. The topic I'm going to discuss today is the United States and China trade war. Um, For my presentation, I would like to discuss one of the biggest reasons why I would like to tackle this issue is because the trade relation that we have with China gives over 2.6 million jobs to Americans. With a trade war based like this, it offers new ways for businesses to tap to new customer-based markets, which can continue to boost more employment and economic growth. Another reason is that farmers here in America are struggling due to the tariffs being taxed between the two countries. China put a 25% tax increase on tariffs, so it raised over 100 American products, and soybeans, especially, are one of them. Being that the soybean are one of the most exported tariffs, it causes a problem that mainly the farmers will face. This trade war is not only going to affect the United States but the whole world. But for now, we're going to focus on what's going on in the United States. So today, we're going to talk about currently in the US for the trade war, currently in China, the problem and the causes, the consequences, who the trade war impacts, the balance of the nations, and the tariffs enacted today. Currently in the US, where and when did it start? The root of the problem for Trump with Canada and Mexico stems from the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, signed in 1994, which the president has called a disaster and one of the worst deals anybody in history has ever entered into. Trump believes that Beijing is using an unfair trade practices to gain an advantage on the U.S., including tax arbitraging of intellectual property tax. The president also takes issue with the size of the U.S. trade deficit with China. The U.S. puts tariffs on China that amounts to about $50 billion, although they will come into effect into two tranches, with the first round covering 818 products worth about $34 billion. A second round will cover 284 more products. Among the products on the list are nuclear reactors, boats, aircrafts, engines, semiconductors, and a lengthy list of our industrial and agricultural machines. Mr. Trump says he wants to stop the unfair transfer of American technology and intellectual property to China and protect the jobs. Tariffs, in theory, will make the U.S. products cheaper than imported ones, so encourage consumers to buy American-made products. The idea is they would boost local businesses and support the national economy. But many U.S. companies and industry groups had testified to the U.S. Trade Representative Office that their businesses are being harmed. So currently in China has accused the U.S. of launching the largest trade war in economic history. China imposed tariffs worth $34 billion and has said it will match Trump's $50 billion threat. China's retaliatory targets include the soybeans, which will hit in agriculture communities usually loyal to the president, as well as cotton, corn, tobacco, and cars. In response to the U.S. and China has slapped imported levies on the U.S. grown soybeans, along with medical equipment and crude oil. Custom authorities now in Shanghai are already reportedly delaying the passage of U.S. exports. Chinese stocks on the country's CSI 300 index have fallen 13% since the United States unveiled its tariffs targets in mid-June. In contrast, the U.S. S&P 500 index has risen 4%. So Ketchen said China would look to quickly remote goods to other countries if the U.S. became untenable. The worst case scenario is that China has no longer going to export 500 billion of goods to the U.S. market, and then it's dependent on how quickly you can diversify those export goods to other countries. Actually, I think China could act quickly, it said so. So who it impacts? The car industries are one of the major impacts of the trade war. Among the companies, the car industry seems to have been the most affected so far. Major car makers recently warned that changes to trade policies were harming their performance. Ford and General Motors have lowered profit forecasts for 2018, citing higher steel and aluminum prices caused by the new U.S. tariffs. Also, exporting tariffs have been placed on the U.S. imports of cars and auto parts. That promises to have disastrous impacts on the European auto industry as well, including that of the UK. Also, it hurts the US and China relations. Mr. Trump accused China of manipulating its currency, a sign that row could only be spreading to the foreign exchange markets. Smaller Asian countries further down the supply chain could also suffer. According to an economist, 30% of the value of the goods China exports to America originates from third-party countries. What also is affected is the agriculture in the U.S. The retaliatory tariffs China is imposing affect a wide variety of American agricultural products, including pork, soybeans, and wheat, as well as U.S. automobiles, and U.S. farmer profits are at some of their lowest levels in more than a decade, according to the Department of Agriculture. Beijing's important levies could end up costing farmers in the state of Missouri as much as $138 million annually, said Gersony, the owner of the C.L. Gersony family farm. That includes the impact of the lower of the prices for farmer commodities and potential lost business due to the new import duties. Also, 1 in 4 pigs raised in the U.S. is sold overseas, and the Chinese are the world's most top consumers of pork. Missouri is one of the top 10 states in the pork production. Tariffs in place, many farmers fear that China will cancel soybeans along with the shipments of pork to the U.S. for the remainder of the year. And finally, forcing U.S. companies to go abroad. For example, Harley-Davidson announced last month that it is moving more production outside the U.S. to avoid the new EU tariffs imposed in response to Trump's steel tariffs. The president accused Milwaukee-based company of surrendering and threatening it with the taxation. So the possible consequences of this is that even worse, a global trade war might jeopardize the multilateral trading system itself. It would no doubt result in tariff increases greater than anything we've seen in recent history. The UNCTAD research shows that average tariffs could raise from negotiable levels as high as 30% for U.S. exporters, 35% and 40% for EU and Chinese exporters, respectively. A trade war would be a severe blow to the world's poorest countries, and to hope that of doubling at least developed countries' share of global exports by 2020 under the Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, trade war actions sugar loss for everyone. In a trade war, companies across the world range of sectors will lose profits and workers will lose jobs. Governments will lose revenue and consumers will have fewer product choices available. No matter where they are, firms, governments, and households will incur high costs, and nobody wins trade war in the end. So here we have a graph of the imbalance of the nations that Trump tries to show in relation to why he's raising the taxes against China. It shares the U.S. trade deficit in the goods by country, with India being the lowest up to China being the highest over the 45%. While China has a surplus with the European Union and the US, it has a deficit with other countries, which can show the pattern of the trade deficit in goods by country. China exports intermediate products and export final products, and the data overestimated China's surplus with the EU and the US. The trade deficit with China is still high, and 46% of the total US deficit with China in 2017, while 43% of the total deficit with the rest of the 7 countries is split. So, in tariffs enacted today, Trump's administration tariffs on 50% billion worth of the Chinese products. China retaliated immediately, imposing an equivalent of 25% of the tariffs on all over 500 types of American products. So this is the first part of the 50 billion of the tariffs that Trump promised last month on Chinese imports that contained industrial significant technologies. These included jet engines, robots, cars, machinery. Trump accuses China of effectively stealing American industrial intellectual property. These targets this week include items such as industrial lasts and electronic vehicles. And 2, with China has slapped import levies on the U.S. grown soybeans, medical equipment, and crude oil. Customs authorities in Shanghai are already reportedly delaying the passage of the U.S. imports. China's tariffs primarily target agricultural goods and auto parts, the 2 industries that dominate the midstream states where President Donald Trump's trade policies have garnered so much support. The implications of this economic tit-for-tat could be huge. China's Ministry of Commerce already declared the biggest trade war of economy history so far. According to the Tax Foundation's modeling, if the Trump administration enacts all the current threatened tariffs on automobile parts and Chinese imports, if trading partners follow through with the regulatory tariffs they have announced so far, then the U.S. GDP will fall by 0.47%, which is $117.6 billion in the long run, effectively, and the offsetting of 1/4 of the long-run impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Wages will fall by 0.33% and employment would fall by around 370,000. If the escalation continues, the numbers will worsen. In an analysis published back in March, Penn War and Budget Model researchers estimated that the all-out trade war would reduce U.S. GDP by 0.9% and the wages by 1.1% by 2027 due to the trade war against the U.S. and China. And then here I just have my references. Thank you.